4. The train car emptied as it went into the country. People getting on and off stared with open curiosity at the somewhat schlumpy man sitting in seat 6A, a large plastic crate on the empty seat next to him. Inside, a large cat glared balefully out at anyone who bent over to coo at it. One child nearly lost a finger when he tried to stick it in between the slats of the crate. The man, one Linus Baker of 86 Hermes Way, barely noticed. He hadn't slept well the night before, tossing and turning in his bed before finally giving up and deciding his time was better spent pacing back and forth in the sitting room. His luggage, an old scuffed bag with a broken wheel, sat near the door, mocking him. He'd packed it before attempting to sleep, sure he wouldn't have time in the morning. As it turned out, he had all the time in the world, seeing as how sleep remained elusive. By the time he boarded the train at 6:30, he was in a daze, the bags under his eyes pronounced, his mouth curled down. He stared straight ahead, one hand resting atop the crate where Calliope fumed. She'd never done well with travel, but he didn't have a choice in the matter. He'd considered asking Mrs. Clapper to take care of her in his absence, but the squirrel debacle had most likely soured any chance of Calliope making it through the month unharmed. He hoped none of the children were allergic. Rain sluiced down the windows as the train chugged along through empty fields and forests with great old trees. He'd been on the train for almost 8 hours when he realized it was quiet. Too quiet. He looked up from the rules and regulations he'd brought from home. He was the only one left in the train car. He hadn't noticed when the last person had left. Huh, he said to himself. Wouldn't that just beat all if I missed my stop? I wonder how far the train goes. Maybe it goes on and on, never reaching the end. Calliope had no opinion of it one way or another. He was about to start worrying that he had, in fact, missed his stop. Linus was nothing if not a consummate worrier, when an attendant in a snappy uniform slid open a door at the end of the car. He was humming to himself quietly, but it was cut off when he noticed Linus. "Hello," he said amiably. "I didn't expect anyone else to be here. Must be going a long way on this fine Saturday." "I have my ticket," Linus said, "if you need to see it." "If you please. Where are you headed?" For a moment, Linus couldn't think. He reached into his coat for his ticket, the large tome in his lap almost falling to the floor. The ticket was slightly crumpled, and he attempted to smooth it out before handing it over. The attendant smiled at him before looking down at the ticket. He whistled lowly. "Marcius, end of the line." He punched it with his clicker. "Well, good news then. 2 more stops and you're there. In fact, if you... Ah, yes, look." He gestured toward the window. Linus turned his head, and his breath caught in his throat. It was as if the rain clouds had reached as far as they could. The gray darkness gave way to a bright and wonderful blue like Linus had never seen before. The rain stopped as they passed out of the storm and into the sun. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the warmth through the glass against his face. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt sunlight. He opened his eyes again, and that's when he saw it. In the distance, there was green. Bright and beautiful greens of waving grass, and what appeared to be flowers in pinks and purples and golds. They disappeared into white sand, and beyond the white was cerulean. He barely noticed when the rules and regulations fell to the floor of the train with a loud thump. "Don't you wish you were here?" "Is that the ocean?" Linus whispered. "It is," the attendant said. "Quite the sight, isn't it? Though you act like you've never... Say, have you never seen the ocean before?" Linus shook his head minutely. "Only in pictures." "It's so much bigger than I thought it'd be," the attendant laughed. "And that's only a small portion of it. I reckon you'll see a bit more when you depart the train. There's an island near the village. Takes a ferry to get to it if you're so inclined. Most aren't." "I am," Linus said, still staring at the glimpses of the sea. "And who do we have here?" the attendant asked, bending over Linus toward the crate. Calliope hissed. The attendant stood quickly. "I think I'll leave her be. Probably for the best. 2 more stops, sir. the attendant said, heading for the door at the opposite end of the train car. "Enjoy your visit." Linus barely heard him leave. "It's really there," he said quietly. "It's really, really there. I'd never thought." He sighed. "Maybe this won't be so bad after all." It wasn't bad. It was worse. But Linus didn't know that right away. The moment he stepped off the train, crate in one hand, luggage in the other, he smelled salt in the air and heard the call of seabirds overhead. A breeze ruffled his hair, and he turned his face toward the sun. He let himself breathe for a moment, basking in the warmth. It wasn't until the bell on the train rang out and it started chugging away that he looked around. He stood on a raised platform. There were metal benches in front of him under an overhang. The overhang was painted in blue and white stripes. Along the edges of the platform and stretching as far as he could see was beach grass growing atop dunes of sand. He heard what sounded like waves crashing in the distance. He'd never seen anything looking so bright. It was as if this place had never seen a rain cloud. The train disappeared around a corner, and Linus Baker realized he was completely alone. There was a small, cobbled road that disappeared between the dunes, but Linus couldn't see where it led to. He hoped he wouldn't have to walk along it, not while carrying his luggage and an angry cat. What should we do? He wondered aloud. No one responded, which was probably for the best. If someone had responded, he probably would have. A loud ringing noise startled him from his thoughts. He jerked his head. There, hanging on the side of the train platform, was a bright orange phone. "Should I answer it?" he asked Calliope, tilting his head toward the front of the crate. Calliope turned around completely, presenting him with her rum. He figured that was the best he was going to get. He left his luggage where it was and walked toward the phone. He set the crate down in the shade. He stared at the ringing phone for a moment before steeling himself and picking it up. "Hello?" "Ah, finally," a voice said in response. "You're late." "I am?" "Yes. I've called 4 times in the last hour. Since I couldn't be sure you'd actually arrive, I didn't want to make the trip off the island until I was sure you'd be there." "You're calling for Linus Baker, correct?" She snorted. "Who else would I be calling for?" He felt relieved. "I'm Linus Baker." "Bully for you." Linus frowned. "Pardon?" "I'll be there in an hour, Mr. Baker." He heard a whispering in the background. "I'm told you have an envelope you need to open now that you've arrived. It would be best if you did so. Things will make more sense if you do." "How did you know about—" "Toodaloo, Mr. Baker, I'll see you shortly." The line cut off, and he was left with the dial tone. He stared at the handset before hanging it back where it belonged. He stared at it for a moment more before shaking his head. "Now then," he said to Calliope as he sat on the bench with a huff. He pulled his suitcase toward him. "Let's see what all the secrecy is about, shall we?" Calliope ignored him. He unzipped his bag enough for him to reach inside for the envelope he'd placed on top. It was thick, nearly bursting at the seams. The seal on the back was made of blood-red wax, the word dicamy stamped into it. He broke the seal, the wax crumbling onto his lap and bouncing to the ground. He pulled out the bundle of papers, held together by a leather strap. On the top was a letter addressed to him, typed neatly and cleanly. "Department in charge of magical youth. Offices of extremely upper management. Mr. Baker, you have been chosen for the most important of assignments. As a reminder, this is classified level 4. Any parties disseminating information to those who do not meet the required classification level will receive punishment beginning at immediate termination and up to incarceration for 10 years. Enclosed, you will find 7 files. 6 belong to the children at the Marsyas Island Orphanage. The 7th belongs to Master Arthur Parnassus. Under no circumstances should you share any of the contents of these files with the residents of the Marsyas Island Orphanage. They are for your eyes only. This orphanage is different than all the others you've been to, Mr. Baker. It is important that you do your best to protect yourself. You will be staying at the guest house on the island, and we suggest locking all the doors and windows at night to avoid any disturbances." "Oh dear," Linus breathed. Your work on Marsyas is important. Your reports will provide us with the necessary information to see if this orphanage can remain open, or if it needs to be shut permanently. Arthur Parnassus has been entrusted with a great responsibility, but it remains to be seen if that trust is still warranted. Eyes and ears open, Mr. Baker. Always. We expect the searing honesty you're known for. If anything appears out of order, you must bring it to our attention. There is nothing more important than ensuring things are on the up and up. And also, make sure the children are safe, of course. From each other and themselves. One, in particular. His file is the first you'll see. We look forward to your extraordinarily thorough reports. Sincerely, Charles Werner, extremely upper management. What on earth have I gotten myself into now? Linus whispered as another breeze ruffled the letter in his hand. He read through the letter a second time, trying to read between the lines, but he was left with more questions than answers. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket before looking at the files in his hand. No time like the present, I suppose, he told Calliope. Let's see how big of a secret this actually is. I'm sure this is all blown out of proportion. The higher your expectations, the greater the disappointment. He flipped open the first file. Attached to the top was a photograph of a young boy of perhaps 6 or 7 years of age. He was smiling rather devilishly. He was missing his 2 front teeth. His hair was a mess, sticking up all over the place, and his eyes were, well, they looked as if they were suffering from red-eye effect, the flash happening too quickly for the pupils to react. There was a ring of blue around the red. It was certainly chilling, but Linus had seen it many times before. Just a trick of the light. That's all it was. Underneath the photograph, in blocky letters, was a name. Lucy. A boy named Lucy, Linus said. That's certainly a first. I wonder why they chose the name Lucy. The last word came out choked. There, written in clear English, was exactly the reason why. The file read, Name, Lucifer, nickname Lucy. Age, 6 years, 6 months, 6 days, at time of this report. Hair, black. Eye color, blue/red. Mother, unknown, believed deceased. Father, the devil. Species of magical youth? Antichrist. Linus Baker fainted, dead away. Go away, he muttered when he felt a tapping against his cheek. It's not time for your breakfast, Calliope. That's good to know, a voice that obviously did not belong to Calliope said. Seeing as how it's afternoon, unless they breakfast late in the city, I wouldn't know. I tend to avoid such places. Too much noise for my taste. Linus opened his eyes, blinking slowly. A woman peered down at him, silhouetted by the sun. Linus sat up quickly. Where am I? The woman took a step back, a look of cool amusement on her face. Marsyas train station, of course. An odd place for a nap, but I suppose it's as good a place as any. Linus pushed himself off the floor of the platform. He felt gritty and out of sorts. There was an ache in his head, and he seemed to have accumulated quite a collection of sand on his backside. He brushed himself off as he looked around wildly. Calliope sat in her crate, tail twitching as she watched him warily. His luggage sat near her, and there, on the bench he'd been sitting on, was a pile of folders. Is this all you've got? The woman asked, and Linus turned his attention back to her. He was immediately concerned when he couldn't quite get a grasp on her age. Her hair sat like a white fluffy cloud atop her head. Bright flowers had been woven in. Her skin was dark and lovely, but it was her eyes that confused Linus the most. They were the eyes of someone far older than the rest of her appearance suggested. It must have been a trick of the bright sunlight, but they looked almost violet. He couldn't place why he thought her familiar. She wore a thin, wispy shirt that hung loosely on her frame. Her trousers were tan and ended mid-calf. Her feet were bare. Who are you? He demanded. Miss Chapelwhite, of course, she said, as if he should have known. Caretaker of Marsyas Island. Caretaker? He repeated. Is that all the luggage you've brought? She asked again. Yes, but to each his own, she said. He stood dumbfounded as she pushed by him, lifting his suitcase as if it were filled with nothing but feathers. He'd broken out in a sweat, lugging it onto the train, but she seemed to have no such issue. Gather your papers and your gigantic cat, Mr. Baker. I don't like to dilly-dally, and you're already later than I expected. I do have responsibilities, you know. Now, see here, he began, but she ignored him, moving toward the stairs at the edge of the platform. She descended the stairs gracefully, as if she were walking on air. It was only then that he noticed a small car idling on the road. The roof appeared to have been sheared off, leaving the seats exposed. A convertible, though he'd never actually seen one in person. He gave very real thought to grabbing Calliope and fleeing down the train tracks. Instead, he gathered his files and lifted the crate, following after the strange woman. She'd already placed his luggage in the trunk by the time he reached the car. She glanced at him, then down at the crate. Don't suppose you'd be fine with putting that thing in the back? Absolutely not, he said, moderately offended. That's just cruel. Right, she muttered. Fine, you'll have to carry it on your lap then, or we can fasten it to the hood if you think that would better. He was scandalized. She would be so angry. Miss Chapelwhite shrugged. I'm sure she'd get over it. I'm not tying her to the hood of the car. Your choice. Get in, Mr. Baker. We'll need to hurry. I told Merle we wouldn't be long. Linus's head was spinning. Merle? The ferryman, she said, opening the door and climbing into the car. He'll take us to the island. I haven't decided if I even want to go to the island. She squinted up at him. Then why are you here? He sputtered. I was told that this isn't... She reached to the dash of the car toward a pair of oversized white sunglasses. Either get in or don't, Mr. Baker. Frankly, I would prefer if you didn't. The department in charge of magical youth is a farce, and you seem to be nothing but a clueless lackey. I'd have no problem leaving you here. I'm sure the train will be back at some point. It always is. That rankled him more than he expected. What I do is most certainly not a farce. The car turned over with a rumbling cough before the engine smoothed out. Black smoke curled from the tailpipe. That, Miss Chapelwhite said, remains to be seen. In or out, Mr. Baker? He got in. Miss Chapelwhite seemed to get far too much enjoyment from the way Linus screamed when they took a corner at a high rate of speed. She handled the car deftly, but Linus was convinced he'd entered the vehicle of a madwoman. The wind whipped through their hair, and Linus thought she'd lose the ornamental flowers, but they snapped and swayed and stayed put. He held the folders flat against the top of the crate, not wanting to lose them over the back of the car. They drove on a narrow road through dunes that rose and fell. When the mountains of sand were at their lowest, he caught glimpses of the ocean, now much closer than it'd been from the train. Linus tried not to be distracted by the sight of it, but failed miserably. Even though he was sure he was about to die, it was still a wonder to behold. It wasn't until he was slammed against the door after yet another corner that he found his voice again. Would you slow down? And wonder of all wonders, she did as he asked. Just having some fun. At my expense. She glanced over at him, hair bouncing around her head. You're wound up awfully tight, he bristled. Wanting to live is not being wound up. Your tie is crooked. It is. Thank you. I hate it when I look disheveled. That's not funny. He saw a flash of teeth through her smile. Maybe there's hope for you after all. Not much, but a little. She looked at him again, for longer than Linus felt was safe. You don't look like I expected. He didn't know what to do with that. He'd never really been seen before. What's that supposed to mean? That you look unexpected. Do you often speak without saying anything at all? Quite often, but not this time, Mr. Baker. She took another corner at a much lower speed. I thought you would be younger. Your type usually is. My type? Caseworkers. Been doing it long? He frowned. Long enough. And you enjoy your work, Mr. Baker? I'm good at it. That's not what I asked. It's the same thing. She shook her head. Why were you sleeping on the platform? Couldn't you have done that on the train? I wasn't sleeping, I was... It hit him then, what he'd forgotten since he'd been rudely awoken. Oh my. What? Oh my. He couldn't catch his breath. Miss Chapelwhite looked alarmed. Are you having a heart attack? He didn't know. He'd never had one before, and he couldn't be sure what they felt like. But given that he was 40 years old, with extra pounds and high blood pressure, that certainly seemed like a possibility. Damn, he heard her mutter as she jerked the car to the side of the road, slamming the brakes. Linus struggled to breathe, putting his forehead on the top of the crate. His vision had narrowed to pinholes, and there was a roaring in his ears. He was sure he was about to pass out again, or possibly die from a heart attack, when he felt a cool hand press against the back of his neck. He managed to suck in a deep breath as his heart rate slowed. There, he heard Miss Chapelwhite say. That's better. Another breath, Mr. Baker. That's it. The file, he managed to say. I read the file. She squeezed the back of his neck once before letting go. About Lucy? Yes, I didn't expect it. No, I don't suppose you did. Is it true? He nodded, face still pressed against the crate. She didn't respond. He lifted his head, looking over at her. She was staring straight ahead, hands in her lap. Yes, she finally said. It's true. How on earth is this possible? She shook her head. It's not. He's not what you think. None of them are. That startled him. I didn't even look at the other files. A terrible thought struck him. Are the others worse? She ripped off her sunglasses, looking at him sharply. It can't be any worse because there's nothing wrong with any of them. The children. Yes, but... No buts, she snapped. I know you have a job to do, Mr. Baker, and I know you probably do it well. Too well, if you ask me. You would have to in order for Dicamy to send you here. We're not exactly orthodox. I should say not. You have the Antichrist on the island. Lucy isn't... She shook her head, obviously frustrated. Why are you here? To ensure the safety of the children, he said, as if it were second nature. To see that they're being provided for, cared for, and that they aren't in danger either from themselves or others. And that goes for all children, correct? Yes, but... No buts. It doesn't matter where he came from or what he is. He is a child, and your job, as much as it is mine or Arthur's, is to protect him, and all the others. He gaped at her. She slid her sunglasses back on. Close your mouth, Mr. Baker. You don't want to swallow a bug. She gunned the engine again and pulled back onto the road. 7 files, he said a few minutes later after coming out of his daze. What? 7 files. I was given 7 files, 6 children, the master of the orphanage. That's 7. Rudimentary counting a priority at Dicamy, is it? He ignored the barb. There isn't one for you. He saw a sign in the distance, approaching on the right at the top of the next hill. Of course not. I'm not employed by Dicamy. I told you. I'm a caretaker. Of the house? That, and also the island. Runs in the family. Has for generations. Linus Baker had been in his job for a long time. And yes, he was good at it. He could think analytically, could notice the little cues that others could not. It was why he thought he'd been chosen for this assignment. That being said, he should have recognized it the moment he opened his eyes on the platform. Fainting after receiving the shock of his life shouldn't have been an excuse. The violet in her eyes should have given it away. It hadn't been a trick of the light. You're a sprite, he said. An island sprite. He'd surprised her. She tried to cover it up, and had he not known what to look for, he would have missed it. What makes you think that? She asked, voice even. You're a caretaker. That means nothing. Your eyes. Unusual, sure, but certainly not unique. You carried my luggage. Oh, I apologize. Had I known I was destroying your toxic masculinity, I wouldn't have... You're barefoot. This caused her to pause. I live near the ocean, she said slowly. Maybe I'm always barefoot. He shook his head. The sun is high in the sky. The road must be extremely hot, and yet you walked along it as if it were nothing. Sprites don't like shoes, too confining, and nothing hurts their feet, not even heated asphalt. She sighed. You're smarter than you look. That can't possibly be good. Are you registered? He demanded. Does Dykamy know that you're... She bared her teeth. I was never in the system, Mr. Baker. My line is far older than the rules of men. Just because you have decided that all magical beings need to be tagged in the wild for tracking doesn't give you the right to question me or my legal status. He blanched. You're right. I shouldn't have said that. Was that an apology? I think so. Good. Don't ask about my status again. It's just... I've never met an island sprite before. A water sprite, yes, and even a cave one once. It's how I was able to recognize you. I didn't know you existed. She snorted. I'm sure there's much you don't know about existing, Mr. Baker. Look, there, we're almost to the ferry. He followed where she was pointing. Up ahead, the sign he'd seen in the distance was approaching as they crested the hill. Above the picture of a palm tree and the waves of the ocean was the legend, Village of Marcius. I've never heard of this place before, he admitted as they drove past. The village. Is it nice? Depends on your definition of nice. To you, probably. To me? No. They reached the top of the hill. Below them, along the edges of the ocean, was a cluster of brightly colored buildings nestled amongst tall trees that had been bent over time with the winds. He could see houses spread out into the forest, all in pastels and thatched roofs. It looked like he always dreamed a place near the ocean would. It caused his heart to ache. We won't stop, so don't ask, she warned him. They don't like it when we do. What do you mean? Not everyone is as progressive as you, Mr. Baker, she said, and he knew he was being mocked. The people of Marcius don't appreciate our kind. That surprised him. Sprites? She laughed again, but the bitterness was heavy. All magical beings, Mr. Baker. It didn't take long to see what she meant. As soon as they pulled into the main thoroughfare, heading through the village, people on the streets and in the shops turned toward the sound of the car. Linus had been on the receiving end of many looks of disapproval in his life, but never once filled with so much hostility. People in board shorts and bikinis and rubber flip-flops turned to glare at them openly as they drove through. He tried waving at a few of them, but it didn't do any good. He even saw a man inside what looked to be a seafood shanty reach up and lock the door as they drove by. Well, I never, Linus said with a sniff. You get used to it, Miss Chapelwhite said. Surprisingly, why are they like this? I don't pretend to know the minds of men, she said, hands tightening on the steering wheel as a woman on the sidewalk appeared to shield her chubby, squawking children away from the car. They fear what they don't understand, and that fear turns to hate for reasons I'm sure even they can't begin to comprehend. And since they don't understand the children, since they fear them, they hate them. This can't be the first time you've heard of this. It happens everywhere. I don't hate anything, Linus said. You lie. He shook his head. No, hate is a waste of time. I'm far too busy to hate anything. I prefer it that way. She glanced at him, her expression hidden behind her sunglasses. She opened her mouth to say what he didn't know, but appeared to change her mind. Instead, she said, We're here. Stay in the car. She parked at the edge of a pier. She got out before Linus could say another word. There was a man standing next to a small ferry, tapping his foot impatiently. Behind him, Linus thought he could see the faint outline of an island. It's getting late, the man snapped at Miss Chapelwhite as she approached, voice drifting over to Linus. You know I can't be at the island after dark. It's fine, Merle. I wouldn't let anything happen to you. That's not as comforting as you seem to think it is. He spat over the edge of the pier into the water before looking over her shoulder at Linus. That's him, then. She glanced back at him. That's him. Thought he'd be younger. That's what I said. All right, let's get on with it, and you tell Parnassus my rates have doubled. She sighed. I'll let him know. Merle nodded, and with one last withering look at Linus, he turned and jumped deftly onto the ferry. Miss Chapelwhite turned back toward the car. I think we might have gotten into something bigger than we were led to believe, Linus whispered to Calliope. She purred in response. All right? He asked as the sprite climbed back inside the car. He wasn't sure it was. Merle seemed to be a troublesome fellow. All right, she muttered. The car turned over again, and she pulled forward as Merle lowered the gate onto the ferry. There was a moment when Linus's stomach dropped as the gate creaked and groaned under their weight, but it was over before he could react. She put the car in park and pressed a button. Linus, startled as the sounds of gears rumbled from the rear of the car. He looked back in time to see a vinyl roof rising up and over them. It locked into place with a terrible finality. She shut the car off before turning toward him. Look, Mr. Baker, I think we got off on the wrong foot. You mean you're not always such a joy to be around? Could have fooled me. She glared at him. I'm a sprite, which means I'm very protective of what's mine. The island, Linus said. She nodded. And all its inhabitants? He hesitated, then, Are you and this Mr. Parnassus? She arched an eyebrow. He flushed as he coughed and looked away. Never mind. She laughed at him, though not unkindly. No, trust me when I say that would never happen. Oh, well, good to know. I know you have a job to do, she continued, and you're finding out it's like nothing you've ever done before. But all I ask is that you give them a chance. They're more than what's in their files. Are you telling me how to do my job? He asked stiffly. I'm asking for an ounce of compassion. I know compassion, Miss Chapelwhite. It's why I do what I do. You really believe that, don't you? He looked at her sharply. What's that supposed to mean? She shook her head. You don't have a file on me because I'm not supposed to exist. Arthur, Mr. Parnassus, sent me as an act of good faith to show you how serious he is. He knows the kind of person you can be. He hopes you can be that person here. Linus felt a trickle of dread at the base of his spine. How does he know a single thing about me? He can't know who was assigned. I didn't even know until yesterday. She shrugged. He has his ways. You should use the time you have left before arriving at the island to review the remaining files. It's best if you know what you're walking into before you do. It'll be safer, I think. For who? There was no answer. He turned to find the driver's seat empty, as if she'd never been there at all. Bugger, he muttered. He considered doing what she asked. Forewarned was forearmed and all that. But he couldn't bring himself to peruse the files after what he'd discovered in Lucy's, fearing that it would only get exponentially worse. Extremely upper management certainly hadn't made things any easier, given their dire warnings about how the inhabitants of the island were unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Miss Chapelwhite had only seemed to confirm that. He wondered briefly if he'd said too much to her, or if she'd managed to peek inside the files while he'd been lying on the platform. Both seemed likely, and he reminded himself to be on his guard from here on in. Not trusting himself to maintain consciousness, he sat with the files on his lap, fingers twitching, the urge to know what he was walking into shrinking in the face of the desire to keep his sanity firmly in place. He thought of all manner of things, from terrible monsters with wickedly sharp teeth to fire and brimstone. They were children, he told himself, but even children could bite if provoked. And if they happened to be worse than what he was imagining, he would rather not know about it beforehand in case he found himself unable to leave the ferry. But still. He shuffled through the files, looking for one in particular. He inhaled sharply when he saw Lucy's and skipped by it as quickly as possible until he found the one he wanted. The master of the house, Arthur Parnassus. The file was thin, consisting of a blurry photograph of a spindly man against a blue background and a single sheet of paper. He certainly seemed normal, but appearances could be deceiving. The file, as much as it could be called that for something so sparse, didn't tell him much more, as certain parts were redacted and the rest were bits and pieces without rhyme or reason. Aside from learning his age, 45, and the fact that his tenure at Marsyas appeared to be without any significant issue, there wasn't much more Linus could glean from it. He didn't know whether he was disappointed or relieved. The sun was beginning to set by the time a bell rang, signaling the arrival at the island. He was lost in thought when the ferry shuddered underneath him, and he looked out the back window to see the ferry gate lowering against a small dock. A shadow stretched over the windshield as he turned around. "This is where you get off!" a voice shouted at him. He peered up through the windshield. Merle stood above him, hands on his hips. "Off!" he repeated. But, "Get off my damn boat!" "What an ass," Linus muttered. The key was still in the ignition, and Linus figured he should at least be thankful for that. He opened the passenger door and almost fell out. He was able to save himself and Calliope at the last second, though she wasn't appreciative of his acrobatics. He set her on the seat and shut the door against her hissing. He tipped a jaunty salute up to Merle as he rounded the back of the car. Merle didn't respond. "Certainly off to an auspicious start," Linus said under his breath. The driver's door creaked as he shut it behind him. It'd been a while since he'd driven. He'd never actually owned a car of his own. It was too much of a hassle in the city. He'd rented one once, years ago, planning on spending a weekend driving out to the country. But he'd been called into work at the last minute and ended up returning the car only an hour after he'd taken it out. He pushed the seat back before turning the key. The car rumbled to life around him. "Okay then," Linus said to Calliope, hands sweating against the steering wheel. "Let's see what we see, shall we?" 5. There were no signs pointing in any direction, but since there was only one road, Linus figured he must be heading the right way. It only took a few minutes of driving away from the ferry landing before he found himself in an old forest, the trees massive, their canopies almost completely blocking out the sky, streaked in pinks and oranges. Leafy vines hung from tree limbs. Loud birds called from unseen perches. "I don't suppose this is some sort of trap?" Linus said to Calliope as it grew darker the deeper into the forest they went. "Maybe this is where everyone goes after they've been sacked. They think they're getting a top assignment, but instead they get sacrificed in the middle of nowhere." It wasn't a pleasant thought, so he pushed it away. He couldn't find the lever for the headlamps, so he leaned forward as close to the windshield as he could get. It was dusk. His stomach rumbled, but he hadn't felt like eating less in his life. He knew Calliope would probably be looking for a litter box soon, but he didn't want to stop until he had some idea where he was. His luck would have Calliope running off into the woods, forcing Linus to chase after her. "And I probably wouldn't," he told her. "I'd leave you out here to fend for yourself." He wouldn't, but she didn't need to know that. The odometer had turned over 2 additional miles, and he was about to start panicking. After all, the island couldn't be that big, could it? When the forest fell away around him, and he saw it. There, ahead of him, set against the falling sun, was a house. Linus had never seen one quite like it before. It was set up a hill, on a cliff overlooking the ocean. It looked as if it were at least 100 years old. It was made of brick, and had a large turret of all things set right in the middle of the roof. The side of the house facing Linus was covered in green ivy, growing around multiple white window frames. He thought he could see the outline of a gazebo set off next to the house and wondered if there was a garden. He would like that very much. He could walk through it, smelling the salt in the air, and... He shook his head. He wasn't here for such things. There would be no time for frivolities. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it right. He turned the car toward what appeared to be a long driveway that led up to the house. The closer he got, the bigger it grew, and Linus couldn't be sure how he'd never heard of this place. Oh, not the orphanage, not if extremely upper management didn't want anyone to know, but surely this island, this house should have been known to him. He racked his brain, but came up empty. The driveway widened near the top of the hill. There was another vehicle parked next to an empty fountain, overgrown by the same vines that latched onto the orphanage. It was a red van, surely big enough for 6 children and the master of the house. He wondered if they took many trips. Not into the village, of course, not if the people there weren't inviting. But as he got closer, he saw the van appeared not to have been moved in some time. Weeds grew up through the wheel wells. It appeared they didn't take many trips, if any at all. For a moment, Linus felt a pang, something akin to sorrow. He rubbed a hand against his chest, trying to chase it away. He'd been right then. There was a garden. The last rays of sun seemed to be illuminating the flowers to the side of the house, and Linus blinked when he thought he saw movement. A quick flash before it was gone. He rolled down the window a smidge, just enough to be heard. "Hello?" he called. There was no answer. Feeling slightly braver, he rolled the window down halfway. The thick scent of the ocean filled his nose. Leaves rustled on the branches of the trees. "Hello?" Nothing. "Right," he said. Well, perhaps we can just stay in here until tomorrow. And then he heard the unmistakable giggle of a child. Or maybe we should leave? He said weakly. Calliope scratched the front of the crate. I know. But there appears to be something out there, and I don't know if either of us wants to be eaten. She scratched again. He sighed. She'd been good for the most part. The trip had been long, and it wasn't fair of him to leave her cooped up. Fine, but you will be quiet while I sit here and think and try to ignore childlike laughter coming from the strange house, so very far away from everything I know. She didn't put up a fight when he opened the crate and pulled her into his lap. She sat regally, staring out the window, eyes wide. She didn't make a sound when he stroked her back. All right, Linus said. Let's review, shall we? I can either do what I was sent here to do, or I can sit here and hope a better idea comes to me, preferably where I keep all my bits and bobs as they are. Calliope dug her claws into his thighs. He winced. Yes, I suppose you're right. It is cowardly, but it also means we stay alive. She licked her paw slowly before brushing it over her face. No need to be rude, he muttered. Fine, if I must. He reached for the door handle. I can do this. I will do this. You stay here and I'll... He didn't have time to react. He opened the door and Calliope leapt from his lap. She hit the ground and took off running toward the garden. Of all the... You stupid cat, I will leave you here. He would do no such thing, but empty threats were better than no threats at all. Calliope disappeared beyond a line of perfectly maintained bushes. He thought he saw a flash of her tail, but then she was gone. Linus Baker was not a fool. He prided himself in that regard. He was well aware of his limitations as a human being. When it was dark, he preferred to be locked safely inside his house, wearing his monogrammed pajamas, a record playing on the Victrola, holding a warm drink in his hands. That being said, Calliope was essentially his only friend in the entire world. So, when he climbed out of the car, rocks crunching under his feet in the driveway, it was because he understood that sometimes one had to do unsavory things for those one cared about. He followed where she'd run off to, hoping she hadn't gotten far. The sun was almost gone, and while the house itself was still foreboding, even though lights appeared to be on inside, the sky above was lit in colors he wasn't sure he'd ever seen before, at least not mixed together as they were. He could hear the waves crashing far down below the cliff, and seagulls screamed overhead. He reached the line of bushes that Calliope had disappeared behind. There was a small stone path that led into what he thought was the garden, and he hesitated only briefly before entering. The garden was far bigger than it had first appeared. The gazebo that he'd seen from the road was farther ahead, strung with red and orange paper lanterns that swung in the breeze. Their lights flickered softly, and there came the distant sound of chimes. The garden itself was blooming wildly. He didn't see any sunflowers, but there were calla and Asiatic lilies, dahlias, celogias, chrysanthemums, orange gerberas, and Chinese bellflowers. There were even beauty berries, something he hadn't seen since he was a child. The air was thick and redolent, and it made him slightly dizzy. Calliope, he called softly. Come now, don't make this difficult. She didn't appear. Fine then, he said irritably. I can always make a new friend. After all, there are many cats who need to be adopted. A new kitten would fix this problem quite easily. I'll just leave you here. It's for the best. He would do no such thing, of course. He continued on. There was an apple tree growing near the house, and Linus blinked when he saw red and green and pinkish apples, all different varieties growing on the same limbs. He followed the trunk down toward the ground and saw a little statue, a garden gnome. How quaint, he murmured as he moved toward the tree. The statue was bigger than the ones he'd seen before, the tip of its pointed cap about waist high. It had a white beard, and its hands were clasped at its front. The paint job that had been done on the statue was remarkably detailed, almost lifelike in the fading light. The eyes were bright blue, and its cheeks were rosy. "Strange statue, aren't you?" he said, hunkering down in front of it. Had Linus been in his right mind, he would have noticed the eyes. However, he was tired, out of sorts, and worried about his cat. Therefore, the noise that came out of him wasn't that surprising when the gnome statue blinked and said rather haughtily,
"You can't say something like that about a person. It's rude. Don't you know anything?"
His scream was strangled as he fell backward, hand digging into the grass underneath him. The gnome sniffed.
"You're awfully loud. I don't like it when people are loud in my garden. If you're loud, you can't hear the flowers talking."
And she, because she was a she, beard and all, reached up and straightened her cap.
"Gardens are quiet spaces."
Linus struggled to find his voice. You... She frowned.
"Of course I'm me. Who else would I be?"
He shook his head, managing to clear the cobwebs before latching onto a name. "You're a gnome." She blinked owlishly at him.
"Yes, I am. I'm Talia."
She bent over and picked up a small shovel that had been laying on the grass next to her.
"Are you Mr. Baker? If you are, we've been expecting you. If not, you're trespassing, and you should leave before I bury you here in my garden. No one would ever know because the roots would eat your entrails and bones."
She frowned again.
"I think. I've never buried anyone before. It would be a learning experience for the both of us."
"I'm Mr. Baker," Talia sighed, sounding incredibly disappointed.
"Of course you are. No need to shout about it. But is it too much to ask for a trespasser? I've always wanted to see if humans make good fertilizer. It seems like they would."
She eyed him up and down hungrily.
"All that flesh."
"Oh, dear," Linus managed to say. She huffed out a breath.
"We don't get trespassers here. Unless I saw a cat. Did you bring it as a gift for the house? Lucy will be excited about that, and maybe when he's done with it, he'll let me use what's left. It's not the same as a human, but I'm sure it'll work."
"She's not an offering," Linus said aghast. "She's a pet."
"Oh, darn."
"Her name is Calliope."
"Well, we better find her before the others do. I don't know what they'll think of her."
She grinned at him, her teeth large and square.
"Aside from looking tasty, that is."
Linus squeaked. She waddled toward him, her stubby legs moving quickly.
"Are you going to lie there all night? Get up, get up!"
He did. Somehow he did. He was sweating profusely as he followed her farther into the garden, listening as she muttered under her breath. It sounded as if she were speaking gnomish, her grunts low and guttural, but Linus hadn't ever heard it spoken aloud before, so he couldn't be sure. They reached the gazebo, which creaked as they stepped onto it. The paper lanterns were brighter now, swinging on their lines. There were chairs with thick, comfy cushions. Underneath them was an ornate rug, the edges of which were curled. Talia went to a small chest that was set off to the side. She pushed open the lid and hung her shovel on a hook inside, next to other gardening tools. Once she seemed satisfied that everything was in place, she nodded and closed the lid. She turned back toward him.
"Now, if I were a cat, where would I be?"
"I don't know." She rolled her eyes.
"Of course you don't. Cats are cunning and mysterious. That doesn't seem like something you'd understand."
"I beg your..." She stroked her beard.
"We need help. Fortunately, I know just who to ask."
She looked at the ceiling of the gazebo.
"Theodore!"
Linus frantically thought back to the files he hadn't looked at. Oh, what a fool he'd been. Theodore, who is from somewhere above, came a cry that sent shivers down Linus's spine. Talia's eyes were sparkling.
"He's coming. He'll know what to do. He can find anything."
Linus took a step back, ready to grab Talia and run if needed. A dark shape swooped into the gazebo, landing artlessly on the floor. It squawked angrily as it tripped over its two big wings, rolled end over end until it crashed into Linus's legs. Linus did his best not to shriek, but unfortunately, his best wasn't good enough. A scaly tail twitched as its owner stared up at him with bright orange eyes. Linus had never actually seen a wyvern in person before. They were quite rare, and thought to be descended from ancient reptiles that once roamed the earth, though they were barely larger than a house cat. Many considered them to be nuisances, and for a long time they were hunted down, their heads used as trophies, their skin made into fashionable shoes. It wasn't until laws were enacted protecting all magical creatures that the barbaric acts ceased. But by then, it'd almost been too late, especially in the face of empirical evidence that wyverns were capable of emotionally complex reasoning that rivaled even humans. Their numbers had dwindled alarmingly. So it was with fascination, tinged of course with horror, that Linus stared down at the wyvern at his feet, a tail beginning to wrap around his ankle. He, Linus reminded himself, was smaller than Calliope, though not by much. His scales were iridescent, the light from the lanterns above casting a kaleidoscope of colors. His hind legs were thickly muscled, the claws at the tips of his feet black and wicked sharp. He didn't have front legs. Instead, his wings were long and leathery like a bat's. His head was curved downward, the snout ending in twin slits. His tongue snaked out and flicked against Linus's loafers. His orange eyes blinked slowly. He jerked his head up toward Linus and chirped. Linus's heart was thundering in his chest. "Theodore, I presume?" The wyvern chirped again. He wasn't unlike a bird, a very large, scaly bird.
Well?
Talia asked. "Well, what?" Linus croaked out, wondering if it was rude to try to kick the wyvern away. The tail was tightening around his leg, and Theodore's fangs were awfully big.
He's asking you for a coin,
Talia said as if it were obvious. "A coin?"
for his hoard.
Talia said as if he would laugh.
He'll help you, but you have to pay him.
"That's not, I don't."
Ooh,
Talia said.
do you not have a coin? That isn't good.
He looked up at her frantically. "What? Why?"
Perhaps I'll have human fertilizer after all,
she said ominously. Linus immediately reached for his pockets. Surely there had to be something. Aha! He pulled his hand out triumphantly. "There," he crowed. "I have a button?" Yes, a button. It was small and made of brass, and for the life of him, Linus couldn't remember where it had come from. It wasn't really his style. Linus tended toward muted colors, and this was bright and shiny, and Theodore clicked in the back of his throat. He almost sounded as if he were purring. Linus looked down again to see Theodore picking himself up from the floor. He seemed to have a bit of trouble. His wings were far too big for something of his size. His legs kept getting caught in them, causing him to stumble. Theodore chirped angrily before using his tail wrapped around Linus's calf as support. He managed to right himself before letting Linus go, never taking his eyes off the button. As soon as he was upright, he began to bounce on his legs around Linus, opening and closing his jaws.
Well, give it to him,
Talia said.
You can't just offer a wyvern a gift and then keep it from him. The last time someone did that, he lit them on fire.
Linus looked up at her sharply. Wyverns can't breathe fire. She grinned again.
You're not as gullible as you look. And you look really gullible. I'll have to remember that.
Theodore was jumping higher and higher, trying to get his attention, wings fluttering. He was chirping loudly and his eyes were blazing. All right, Linus said. You'll get it, but I won't have you making a scene. Patience is a virtue. Theodore landed on the ground and spun himself in a circle before arching his neck up toward Linus. He opened his mouth and waited. His fangs were very big and very sharp.
You have to put it in his mouth,
Talia whispered.
Quite possibly your whole hand.
Linus ignored her. Swallowing thickly, he reached down and set the tip of the button in Theodore's mouth. The wyvern bit down slowly, taking the button. Linus pulled his hand away as Theodore fell onto his back, wings spreading out on the floor. His stomach was pale and looked soft. He raised his back legs to his mouth until he could clutch the button. Holding it in his claws, he lifted the button toward his head, studying it carefully, spinning it around to see either side. He chirped loudly as he flipped himself over. He glanced back at Linus before spreading his wings and clumsily taking off. He almost tripped, but at the last moment managed to fly off toward the house. "Where's he going?" Linus asked faintly.
To put it with the rest of his horde,
Talia said.
Something you'll never find, so don't even think about it. A wyvern is very protective over his horde and will maim anyone who tries to take it from him.
She paused, considering.
It's underneath the sofa in the living room. You should go check it out.
But you just said... Ah, I see. She stared innocently at him. He was supposed to help us find Calliope, he reminded her.
He was? I never said that. I just wanted to see what you'd give him. Why do you have buttons in your pocket? That's not where they go.
She squinted at him.
Do you not know that?
I know where... He shook his head. No, I won't. I am going to find my cat with or without your help. And if I have to tromp through your garden to do it, I will.
You wouldn't dare.
Wouldn't I? She sniffed.
Fee.
Bless you, Linus said.
What? I didn't sneeze. It was... Fee.
Yeah, another voice said. I heard you the first time. Linus whirled around. There was a dirty girl of perhaps 10 years of age standing behind them. She had smudges of dirt on her face that almost covered the bright freckles dotting her pale skin. She blew out a breath, and a lock of fire-red hair fluttered off her forehead. She was wearing shorts and a tank top. She was barefoot, and her toenails had grime underneath them. But it was the thin wings that rose from her back that caught Linus's attention the most. They were translucent, lined with veins, and they curled around her shoulders, much larger than he would expect from one her size. A sprite, like Miss Chapelwhite, though there were marked differences. There was an earthy scent emanating from her that reminded Linus of the drive through the trees to get to the house, dense and thick. He thought it was possible they were her doing. A forest sprite. Linus had only met a handful of sprites before. They tended to be solitary creatures, and the younger they were, the more dangerous. They weren't in full control of their magic. Once, Linus had seen the aftermath of a young lake sprite who had felt threatened by a group of people on a boat. The water level had risen almost 6 feet, and what remained of the boat had floated on the choppy surface in pieces. He didn't know what had happened to that sprite after he filed his report. That information was above his pay grade. This sprite, however, Fee, reminded him of the lake sprite from years before. She was looking at him distrustfully, her wings twitching.
This him?
She asked.
Doesn't seem like much. He's not gullible, Talia said. So he has that going for him at least. He brought a cat that escaped. Better not let Lucy find it. You know what he'll do.
Linus had to regain control of the situation. They were just children, after all. My name is Linus Baker, and her name is Calliope. Fee ignored him as she walked by him, the tip of her left wing smacking him in the face.
It's not in the woods,
she told Talia. Talia sighed.
I didn't think so, but figured I'd ask. I need to go get cleaned up,
Fee told her.
If you haven't found it by the time I'm done, I'll come back and help.
She glanced back at Linus before walking out of the gazebo toward the house.
She doesn't like you,
Talia said.
Don't feel too bad about it, though. She doesn't like most people. It isn't personal, I don't think. She would just rather you weren't here, or alive.
I'm sure, Linus said stiffly. Now, if you could point me toward... Talia clapped her hands in front of her beard.
That's it. I know where we need to look. They were supposed to be getting it ready for you, and I bet Sal's got her. He's good with strays.
She waddled toward the opposite end of the gazebo before looking over her shoulder at him.
Come on. Don't you want to get your cat?
Linus did, and so he followed. Talia led them through the garden around the side of the house that he hadn't been able to see from the road. The light was fading, and he could see stars appearing overhead. The air was cool now, and he shivered. Talia, for her part, pointed out every single flower they came across, telling him their names and when she'd planted them. She warned him not to touch them, or she'd have to hit him upside the head with her shovel. Linus didn't dare try her. She obviously had a propensity for violence, and he needed to remember that for his reports. This investigation wasn't off to a great start. He had many concerns, specifically that all these children appeared to be scattered about. "Where is the master of the house?" Linus asked as they left the garden behind. "Why isn't he keeping an eye out for you?"
Arthur?
Talia asked.
Why on earth would he?
"Mr. Parnassus," Linus insisted. "It's only polite to refer to him by a proper name, and he should be, because you're a child."
I'm 263 years old.
"And gnomes don't reach an age of maturity until they're 500, Linus said. "You may think me a fool, but that would be a mistake." She grumbled something in what Linus was now convinced was gnomish.
From 5 in the afternoon until 7, we're given time for personal pursuits. Arthur, excuse me, Mr. Parnassus, believes we should explore whatever interests us.
"Highly unusual," Linus muttered. Talia glanced at him.
It is? Don't you do things you like after you get done working?
"Well, yes. Yes, he did. But he was an adult, and that was different. What if one of you gets hurt while in your personal pursuit? He can't be lazing about while—"
He's not lazing about,
Talia exclaimed.
He works with Lucy to make sure he doesn't bring about the end of the world as we know it.
It was about this time that Linus felt his vision gray yet again at the thought of this child, this Lucy. He couldn't believe that such a creature existed without his knowledge, without the world's knowledge. Oh, he understood why there was secrecy and could even comprehend the need for it, but the fact that there was a weapon of mass destruction in the body of a 6-year-old and the world wasn't prepared was a shock.
You've gone awfully pale,
Talia said as she squinted up at him.
And you're swaying. Are you ill? If you are, I think we should go back to the garden so you can die there. I don't want to have to drag you all the way back. You look really heavy.
She reached up and poked his stomach.
So soft.
Strangely, that simple action managed to clear his vision. "I'm not ill," he snapped at her. "I'm just processing."
Oh, that's too bad. If your left upper arm starts to hurt, would you let me know?
"Why would I? That's a sign of a heart attack, isn't it?" She nodded. "I demand you take me to Mr. Parnassus this instant." She cocked her head at him.
But what about your cat? Don't you want to find her before she gets eaten? And all that's left is her tail because it's too fluffy to choke down?
"This is very perturbing and irregular. If this is the way this orphanage is run, I will need to inform—" Her eyes widened before she grabbed him by the hand and began to pull him.
We're fine. See, everything is fine. I'm not dead and you're not dead and nobody is hurt. After all, we're on an island with no way on or off aside from a ferry. And the house has electricity and working toilets, something we're very proud of. What could possibly happen to any of us? And Zoe keeps an eye on us when Mr. Parnassus is otherwise detained.
"Zoe?" Linus demanded. "Who is—"
Oh, I meant Miss Chupwhite,
Talia said hastily.
She's wonderful, so caring. Everyone says so. And distantly related to a fairy king named Dimitri, if you can believe that. Though he's not from around these parts.
Linus's mind was a whirlwind. "What do you mean, fairy king? I've never—"
So you see, there is absolutely nothing to worry about. We're always monitored with everything we do, so no need to inform anyone of anything. And would you look at that? I knew Sal would have your cat. Animals love him. He's the best. See, Calliope looks so happy, doesn't she?
And indeed she did. She was rubbing up against the legs of a large black boy sitting on the porch of a small house, set away from the big house. Her back arched as he traced a finger down her spine, tail swishing lazily from side to side. The boy smiled down at her, and then, wonder of all wonder, Calliope opened her mouth and meowed. A sound Linus couldn't ever remember hearing her make before. It was rusty and deep, and it nearly stopped him in his tracks. She purred, of course, usually her distaste, but she never talked. "Yes," the boy said, voice low. "Such a good girl, aren't you? Yes, you are. Prettiest girl."
Okay,
Talia said quietly.
No sudden movements, okay? You don't wanna...
That's my cat, Linus said loudly. You there! How did you get her to do that?
Scare him,
Talia finished with a sigh.
Now you've gone and done it.
The boy looked up fearfully at the sound of Linus's voice. His big shoulders hunched as he appeared to sink inward. One moment, there was a handsome boy with dark eyes, and the next, the clothes he'd been wearing fell to the porch, as if the body wearing them had disappeared from the face of the earth. Linus stopped, jaw dropping, except, even as he watched, the pile of clothes began to shift. There was a flash of white hair, and then the clothes fell away. Sal, the large boy who had to weigh at least 150 pounds, was gone, but not completely, because he had turned into a 5-pound Pomeranian, a fluffy 5-pound Pomeranian. The hair around his head was white, shot with rusty orange that extended down his back and legs. His tail was curled up behind his back, and before Linus could process the fact that he'd seen an actual shifter change before him, Sal gave a high-pitched bark and turned and ran into the guest house. My word, Linus breathed. That was... He didn't know how to finish.
I told you not to scare him,
Talia said crossly.
He's very nervous, you know. He doesn't like strangers or loudness, and here you are being both.
Calliope seemed to agree as she glared at Linus before she climbed the steps and disappeared into the house as well. The house itself was tiny, even smaller than Linus's own. The porch wasn't big enough for a rocking chair, but it looked charming, flowers growing along the front underneath windows that had a warm and inviting light pouring out of them. It, too, was made of brick, much like the main house, but it didn't exude the dread Linus had felt upon arrival. He could hear barking coming from inside the house. There was a response that sounded high-pitched and garbled, as if someone was throwing a wet sponge on the floor repeatedly.
Chauncey's here too,
Talia said, sounding delighted.
He probably grabbed your luggage for you while we were in the garden. He's very hospitable, you know. He wants to be a bellhop when he gets older. The uniform with the little hat and everything.
She looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes that Linus distrusted immediately.
Do you think he'd be good at that, Mr. Baker?
And because Linus believed in the power of positive thinking, he said, I don't see why not, even though he wondered what Chauncey could possibly be. Talia smiled sweetly as if she didn't believe a single word. The inside of the house was just as endearing as the outside. There was a sitting room with a comfortable-looking chair in front of a brick fireplace, and a table sitting in a nook in front of one of the windows. The barking sound came from farther down the hall, and for a moment, Linus was slightly disoriented because there didn't seem to be... Where's the kitchen? He asked. Talia shrugged.
There isn't one. Whoever owned the house before seemed to think everyone should eat together in the main house. You get to eat with all of us. Probably for the best, so you can see we eat only the healthiest foods and are civilized, or whatever.
But there's... Sir! A wet and warbled voice exclaimed from behind him. Might I take your coat? Linus turned to see...
Chauncey!
Talia said, sounding delighted. There, standing, sitting, in the hallway, a tiny dog peering out around him, was an amorphous green blob with bright red lips and black teeth and eyes on stalks that stuck high above his head, seemingly moving independently of each other. He didn't have arms so much as tentacles, with tiny little suckers along their lengths. He was not quite see-through, though Linus could make out the faint outline of Sal hiding behind him. I'm not wearing a coat, Linus heard himself say, though he hadn't actually instructed his brain to say it. Chauncey frowned. Oh, that's disappointing. His eyes wiggled around as he seemed to brighten. As in literally brighten, because he became a lighter shade of green. No matter. I've already attended to your luggage, sir. It's been placed in your room, as has the barbaric cage I assume is for your cat that's now sleeping on your pillow. He held out one of his tentacles. Linus stared at it. Ahem! Chauncey coughed, flipping the tip of his tentacle toward him twice.
You have to pay him,
Talia hissed from behind him. Again, independent of any thought, Linus felt himself reach back for his wallet. He opened it up, found a single, and handed it over. It instantly soaked through as Chauncey's tentacle closed over it. "Wow," he whispered as he pulled the bill close, eyes drooping on their stalks to look it over. "I did it! I'm a bellhop!" Before Linus could respond to that, a chilling voice rang out, sounding as if it were coming from everywhere. The air, the floors, the very walls that surrounded them.
"I am evil incarnate,"
the dastardly voice said.
"I am the blight upon the skin of this world, and I will bring it to its knees. Prepare for the end of days. Your time has come, and the rivers will run with the blood of the innocents."
Talia sighed.
"He's such a drama queen."
Six. Linus Baker, for what it was worth, did care about the children he was tasked with observing. He didn't think one could do what he did and lack empathy, though he couldn't understand how someone like Miss Jenkins had ever been a caseworker before being promoted to supervision. And so when faced with a perceived threat, and even though everything felt topsy-turvy, Linus did the only thing he could. He moved to protect the children. Talia squawked angrily as he shoved her behind him towards Sal and Chauncey.
"What are you doing?"
He ignored her, the ringing in his ears he'd heard since he'd arrived on the island, now turning into a full-blown roar. He took a step toward the open door, and he swore on everything he had that the darkness settling outside had somehow gotten darker. He believed if he stepped out onto the porch, the stars above would be blotted out, and all that would remain would be eternal night. "What's going on?" Chauncey whispered behind him.
"I have no idea,"
Talia said irritably. Sal barked nervously, a high-pitched yip.
"Probably,"
Talia said. Linus took a step toward the door. He should have realized that accepting this assignment was going to be the last thing he'd do. He wondered if Lucy had already taken out Mr. Parnassus, and whoever, or whatever, had been in the main house with them. He couldn't be sure if there were other things that extremely upper management hadn't made him aware of. If there was a clear path, perhaps he could get the children to the car. He'd need to get Calliope into her crate, but he'd rather have an angry cat to deal with than a devil. He didn't know how he'd get them off the island, but he stepped onto the porch. It was darker, perhaps darker than it had ever been before. He could barely see the flowers just off the porch. Everything else was lost to the darkness. It was as if the night were a living thing and had consumed the world. Linus's skin felt electrified.
"Hello,"
a sweet voice said from beside him. Linus gasped and turned his head. There, standing at the edge of the porch, was a child. Lucy looked exactly as he had in the photograph. His black hair was windswept, and his eyes were red and ringed with blue. He looked so small, but the smile on his face was twisted into a sneer, and his fingers were twitching at his sides, as if he were barely restraining himself from reaching out and tearing Linus limb from limb.
"It's nice to see you,"
Lucy sing-songed before giggling.
"I knew you'd come, Mr. Baker. Though by the time I'm done with you, you'll wish you hadn't."
The smile widened until it seemed like his face would split in half. Flames began to rise behind him, though they didn't seem to burn the house, and Linus couldn't feel the heat that should have been pouring off of them.
"I'm going to enjoy this far more than you could ever—"
"That's enough, Lucy." And just like that, everything switched off. Lucy groaned, and the red disappeared from his eyes. The fire subsided. The blackness winked out, and the remains of the sunset appeared on the horizon. The stars were bright, and Linus could see the main house across the way.
"I was just having some fun,"
Lucy muttered, scuffing his shoe against the porch.
"I'm Hellfire. I'm the darkest parts of—"
"You still need to have a bath after supper," the voice said, and Linus felt his heart skip a beat. "Perhaps we could save the Hellfire and the darkest parts for tomorrow." Lucy shrugged.
"Okay."
And then he ran past Linus into the house, shouting for Talia and Chauncey.
"Did you see what I did? He was so scared."
Linus looked off the porch. There, standing in the grass, was a man. He was unlike anyone Linus had ever seen before. He was spindly. His light hair was a mess, sticking up at odd angles. It was starting to gray around his temple. His dark eyes were bright and glittering in the near dark. His aquiline nose had a bump in the center, as if it'd been broken once long ago and never set right. He was smiling, hands clasped in front of him. His fingers were long and elegant as he twiddled his thumbs. He wore a green peacoat, the collar pulled up around his neck against the sea breeze. His slacks appeared too short for his long legs, the hems coming up above his ankles, revealing red socks. He wore black and white wingtip shoes. "Hello, Mr. Baker," Arthur Parnassus said, sounding amused. "Welcome to Marsyas Island." His voice was lighter than Linus expected, almost as if there were musical notes behind each word. "I do hope your trip was most pleasant. The ocean can sometimes be rough in the crossing. Merle. He's from the village, after all." Linus was flabbergasted. He remembered the blurry photograph from the file. In it, Mr. Parnassus had been standing against a blue background, and he hadn't been smiling. But there had been a jovial arch to his eyebrow, and Linus had stared at it for longer than was probably proper. He looked younger in person, far younger than his 45 years suggested. He was as fresh-faced as the young people who came into Dicamy with their shiny degrees and ideas about how things should be done rather than how they actually were. They quickly learned to fall in line. Idealism had no place in government work. Linus shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. It wouldn't do for someone in his position to sit here gawking at the master of an orphanage. Linus Baker was nothing if not a consummate professional, and he had a job to do. "Do you often greet your guests with threats of death and destruction, Mr. Parnassus?" he asked sternly, trying to regain control of the situation. Mr. Parnassus chuckled. "Not usually, though it should be said we don't have many guests. Please, call me Arthur." Linus was tense, listening to the babble of voices behind him. He felt uncomfortable having someone like Lucy behind him, out of sight. "I think Mr. Parnassus will suffice. I will be Mr. Baker during the course of this visit, from you and the children." Mr. Parnassus nodded with barely concealed delight. Linus couldn't be sure what exactly about this situation necessitated such a response. He wondered if he was being mocked somehow, and felt a wave of anger roll over him. He managed to push it down before it could contort his expression. "Mr. Baker it is, then. My apologies for not welcoming you in person upon your arrival." He glanced at the house over Linus's shoulder before looking back at him. "I was otherwise detained with Lucy, though I suspect he attempted to conceal your presence from me." Linus was gobsmacked. "He can do that?" Mr. Parnassus shrugged. "He can do many things, Mr. Baker, but I expect you'll find that out for yourself. It is the reason you're here, isn't it? Fee informed us of your arrival, and Lucy decided he'd welcome you in his own special way." "Special?" Linus said faintly. "That's what you call it?" He took a step toward the porch. "This is an unusual place, filled with things I don't believe you've witnessed before. It would be best if you put your preconceived notions behind you, Mr. Baker. Your visit will be much more enjoyable if you do." Linus bristled. "I'm not here for enjoyment, Mr. Parnassus. This is not a vacation. I'm here as ordered by the department in charge of magical youth to determine if Marsyas Orphanage should remain as is, or if other actions should be taken. You would do well to remember that. The fact that the children were running amok with no supervision isn't the best start." Mr. Parnassus barely seemed affected. "Running amok, you say? Fascinating. And I'm aware of what it is you're here for. I just don't know if you are." "What's that supposed to mean?" He zigged when Linus expected him to zag. "You gave Theodore a button." Linus blinked. "Pardon?" Mr. Parnassus was at the bottom of the steps. Linus had barely seen him move. "A button," he repeated slowly. "Brass. You gave it to Theodore." "Yes, well, it was the first thing I found in my pocket." "Where did it come from?" "What do you mean?" "The button, Mr. Baker," he said. "Where did the button come from?" Linus took a step back. I don't quite know what you mean." Mr. Parnassus nodded. "It's the little things. Little treasures we find without knowing their origin, and they come when we least expect them. It's beautiful when you think about it. He loves it dearly. That was very kind of you." "I was all but ordered to give it to him." "Were you? How about that?" He was on the porch in front of Linus. He was taller, much taller than he had appeared on the grass in front of the house. Linus had to tilt his head back to meet his gaze. He had a freckle that nearly formed a heart below his left eye. A lock of hair had fallen on his forehead. Linus flinched a little when Mr. Parnassus extended a hand. Linus stared at it for a moment, then remembered himself. He took the offered hand in his own. The skin was cool and dry, and as the fingers wrapped around his own, Linus felt a little curl of warmth in the back of his mind. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Mr. Parnassus said, "regardless of the reason you're here." Linus pulled his hand away, palm tingling. "All I ask is that you let me perform my duties without interference." "Because of the children." "Yes," Linus said, "because of the children. They are the most important thing, after all." Mr. Parnassus studied him, looking for what Linus didn't know. Then, "Good. I'm pleased we're off to such a wonderful start. That bodes well for what will certainly be an illuminating month." "I wouldn't call it wonderful." "Children!" Mr. Parnassus called. He bent over deftly, sweeping Sal's discarded clothing in his hand. "Come now, would you?" There was a stampede of feet behind Linus, some heavy, some sounding as if they were squelching. Linus was jostled as they ran by him.